happens to be me today. So Marvin Kwiatkowski, I am been on the board of directors for the Rocky Mountain Goat Alliance for 2.5 years now. I'm based in British Columbia in Kamloops in particular. I've had a passion for goats since I was a pretty small kid, but didn't really get intimate with goats till about 30 years ago when I moved to Northwest British Columbia, where I had goats in my backyard. So I've been pretty passionate in the mountains with goats in many ways. So when the opportunity came up for the Goat Alliance, it was a bit of a no-brainer. I've heard of the Goat Alliance and I've seen some of the projects they've been involved with, so I thought it would be a good thing being in British Columbia where there's a healthy population of goats. I would probably have a lot of stories to tell because I do get out every year with the goats. One that comes to mind is 2 years ago when I took a couple fellows out from Alberta and we got onto 7 mature billies. I learned a lot. Every year I go out, I'm continuing to learn about goats. So we found 7 mature billies in areas that you wouldn't typically think of as being for billies, more what we'd call a nursery, so more gently sloping. There was some significant steep country to get into the spot. It was really hard to access. But once we got in there, we actually found the billies along with some nannies and kids, which is not normal for the summertime to kind of see them together. And kind of what stood out, it was just a gorgeous week we had. We took 2 nice billies. I don't typically shoot goats anymore. It's pretty rare. But after we took 2 billies, the other 5 came pretty much to me, and I spent an hour doing video and photography. And I was pretty much overwhelmed just with being that close and being that intimate with animals that are typically a little bit tougher to get close to unless you're in a park area. And I remember going to my buddies after, I gave them a little hug, and I just said that was one of the highlights of my 30 years, just being that close. The goats were not even spooked away, even though we harvested 2 of them. But yeah, so I have a lot of different opportunities to get out and to kind of mentor younger individuals in regards to goats. Yeah, so that's kind of one of my passions, is more in the education and the mentoring component. I'm going to move on now to our guest speaker because it's not about me, it's about Kim. I think I've been with Kim because I think he's cross-country skied for about 40 years and I've been at it for a while, and I did the ski circuit with my kids. We did a lot of racing. So he and I don't really know that, but we've probably been on some of the same races together, but Kim would have blown right by me. He's in much better conditioning. So he might have been on the podium, but I definitely wasn't on the podium. So aside from that, we're going to get into kind of the meat and potatoes. Kim is an independent biologist with over 40 years of experience in public and private sector throughout Western and Northern Canada. In addition to nearly 4 decades of experience conducting and leading research and management studies on species such as mountain goats, bighorn sheep, elk, caribou, muskoxen, moose, grizzly bears, fur bearers, and raptors. Since 2004, Kim has led and designed baseline studies for industry and reviewed for Indigenous organizations numerous environmental impact assessments in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. And he is based in beautiful Nelson, British Columbia. For those that haven't been there, what a beautiful place to be. And I know I'm extremely excited. I haven't been on a webinar for a while. I've been pretty tied up, but this one I was really keen to be on for numerous factors. Kim is well known in the biology world, and I'm a bit of a junkie for research papers myself. So I've read a few papers where Kim has definitely been instrumental in putting that paper together. So his talk is on diversionary salting in managing human mountain goat conflict. So Kim, I will pass it over to you, and we're excited to have you on this webinar.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Marvin. That's a pretty small world with the cross-country skiing thrown in there. I wasn't expecting that one. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen. And it's going to go.
Yeah, we can see it.
Pardon me?
We can see it. You're good to go.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, Marvin and Stacy, and I appreciate the opportunity to present here this evening. Thanks for the background. When I arrived in BC 27 years ago as an independent biologist, interestingly enough, my first actual job was on a mountain goat project not far from Nelson, off to the west. And since then, I have worked on numerous, possibly countless mountain goat projects, primarily in BC, and much of it on applied research and management. So today I'm going to be discussing diversionary salt licks in the management of human mountain goat conflicts. As everyone knows, mountain goats are cold adapted species that are characteristic of alpine habitats throughout much of Western North America. When you think of mountain goats, you often think of wild and pristine wilderness. As a predator avoidance strategy, they typically occur on or within close proximity to escape terrain, which is generally steep slopes that are difficult for predators to access. So a typical reaction by a mountain goat that is naive to human beings is that humans are perceived as a threat, and the animals will generally flee or avoid the situation or the area. Species that redistribute themselves closer to people and lose their natural wariness of people are a growing management concern, especially in parks and protected areas, as Marvin mentioned, because of the issues with human safety, animal health, and ecological consequences. There are increasing examples of mountain goats becoming tolerant of and attracted to human presence, most of which is related to mineral acquisition. And just to clarify some terms here, habituated goats is often commonly used, but it's a process that's often difficult to document in the field. Thus, technically, it's more appropriate to describe these goats as tolerant or tolerance. I tend to interchange the terms, although I do mean tolerance. Another term that's often used is salt conditioning, and that's the development of an expectation that a reward, in this case salt, will follow from close association with people. And this is very similar to the situation with grizzly and black bears and food conditioning. So goat tolerance of human presence is related to salt and other minerals in kind of two general forms or areas. One is related to camping and hiking, and there's numerous examples in areas of both the US and Canada where this is an issue. And US examples could include Glacier National Park in Montana and Olympic National Park before they moved all the goats. But I'm also going to be dealing with roads and concerns with vehicle mountain goat strikes. And the roads are an issue, again, salt related because of the winter salting or brine that the highways folks put on there for human safety. I'm not going to be touching on it today, but this kind of a salt dependence also affects bighorn and thinhorn sheep, not so much on the hikers and campers side, but more on the highway side. And there's various areas in southeastern BC where sheep are on the highways, and that's an issue. There's also an issue even up in Kluane National Park in the Yukon, that's the top right image, where Dall sheep come down to the highway to lick the salt. And they had an incident a number of years ago where a single truck took out 8 Dall sheep. So they've been concerned with this as well. So mineral licks are very important to mountain goats. They can be termed resource hotspots. Goats ingest the soil or drink the water to obtain supplemental minerals not found in the regular foraging or to support seasonal changes in diet. Salt being NaCl, it's often important, but it's not always the main focus. Calcium, magnesium, and calcium carbonates are also high on the list of what the animals are seeking. Mountain goat mineral licks generally come in three main types: dry licks, such as the one up in the upper left, which is actually adjacent to the Jasper Highway, wet licks or muck licks, and rock incrustations where the goats are literally licking the rock face. The benefits of the mineral licks to goats are detoxification of plant compounds, alleviation of gastrointestinal stress, and regulation of osmotic balance in the digestive tract. Many individuals show long distance movements. It gives you an idea of how important these sources are to the animals. An example here is in the lower left, where this animal lives on the edge of Glacier National Park in BC. But for the 2 years of data that I looked at, it twice went over 30 kilometers to a mineral lick in the Columbia Valley Trench, just south of Golden. So obviously, to take this kind of a trip where there's high risk from predation, etc., you got to have high reward for that. The other thing too I've always noticed is a difference in the availability of natural mineral licks as you travel from east to west in BC. This is a map taken from BC Ministry, which shows in green dots mountain goat mineral licks that we know about. There are quite a few in the Rocky Mountains, in the Columbia Valley Trench, and in the Purcell Mountains. But once you get west of the Nelson area into the Selkirks and Monashees, these are the pink and blue background geography or geology behind it, we hardly know of any natural mineral licks, even with collaring studies. So it's probably related to geology to some extent, although most of these are sedimentary in origin with intrusives. But I think weathering and how old the rock is also important. So Rich Harris and colleagues, and I think I saw that Rich was on the call or on the presentation, recently published a paper called Habituated, Tolerant, or Salt-Conditioned Mountain Goats and Human Safety. These researchers reviewed the literature and presented 10 case studies to show the range of situations, generally hiking and camping related, and this is not necessarily vehicle-based highway strike related. These authors provided interventions available to managers to minimize mountain goat human interactions that can compromise human safety. And they suggested that among these interventions, diversionary salting, quote, requires intensive work for uncertain outcome with health concerns for goats, and that the intervention is informal and poorly documented. So BC is home to roughly 50% of the world's population of mountain goats, and the Kootenays, which is in southeastern BC, has about 20% of the BC population. Mountain goats occur throughout the mountainous terrain in the Kootenay region, with comparatively lower densities in the West Kootenays compared to the East Kootenays. So I'm going to be presenting two ongoing case studies that are occurring in the West Kootenays of BC, where we're using diversionary salt licks to alter goat distribution and behavior. I've tried to make these studies a little bit as rigorous as possible and less informal. So we're going to be talking about the Lardo, shown here in red, and the Gimli area. I'm also going to be mentioning Cathedral Provincial Park, where there has been also ongoing work being done there. So to go into the Lardo Bluffs, it's north of Nelson. It's a small population of perhaps 25 or 30 goats in extent. There may have been more in the past. It is unharvested, or unhunted, I should say. And the extent of seasonal movements by these mountain goats that use the Lardo Bluffs is unknown, but they are wintering elsewhere. As you can see in the upper left figure, it's a fairly steep, bluffy section adjacent to Kootenay Lake. and about 3 kilometers of the highway runs through the base of the cliffs and adjacent to the lake. In about 2015 or so, the highway in this section was resurfaced, and locals reported that that increased the speed by about 10 or 20 kilometers per hour along this area. When they resurfaced the road, they also put rumble strips down the middle, and these are supposed to alert drivers once they start wandering. Although if you want to wander on this very windy section of road, I don't think you'd survive anyway. The rumble strips, unfortunately, when they salt or put brine on the highways in the winter, they tend to precipitate out the salt. So not only then are the goats coming down to the edge of the road to get salt, they're actually coming out into the middle of the road. So the Lardo residents were seeing frequent presence on the highway each year. And the local residents have been monitoring and recording observation of these goats quite extensively for many years. So in 2018, there were at least 2 deaths from vehicle goat collisions. 2 deaths for goats, not for the humans, sorry. After this incident, we began a project that was sponsored by the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, or the Department of Highways, and supported by the local residents. We established 2 diversionary salt licks on observed trails where we had seen that goats were coming down to the highway. And we put these licks about 50 or 80 meters in elevation above the highway. We built trenches to stabilize the area and used loose livestock salt dug into the soil. And we monitored the sites with wildlife cameras, both still cameras and video cameras. Interestingly enough, we left the main site that we put in, and 55 minutes later, a mountain goat was on it already. As I mentioned, we had both still and video cameras, and I've examined over 250,000 images actually from this area since then. And when I examine them, I look at timing, duration, numbers, age, sex, etc. of the animals using it, and species actually, to get an idea of the pattern of use. So the camera images provide us usage of the timing, and what we see is quite typical for mineral licks in other areas where the billies are coming down earlier, and then once the nannies have their kids, they're hitting the sites fairly hard. We're getting peak use in June into early July, tapers off for the summer, and then peters out during the winter. A local resident, Marlene Johnson, who is on the call, I believe, has taken diligent records and observed goats on the highway generally about 4 to 7 times per year annually between 2011 and 2018 before the lick was put in place, averaging about 5 or 6 times a year. And these were often large groups, and they were on the highway for long periods of time. Since the licks were put in place for 2019 to 2023, Marlene has seen no goats on the highway. In fact, between those dates, since the licks were put in place, there's been reported only 1, perhaps 2 reported sightings of mountain goats on the highway. So needless to say, from the highway's perspective and the local residents' perspective, everyone is fairly pleased with this outcome so far. Hopefully this works. I'm just going to give a short video. The interactions of the animals at the site were always interesting to watch. When we put the salt in, we generally dug it into the soil, so the animals had to work a little bit to get at the salt. So there is an ongoing concern with concentrating wildlife at a site. There's a concern with increased predation risk, but we haven't seen a lot of predators, and these are mainly black bears and the odd coyote, and they seem to be passing through. Feeding wild animals can also propagate diseases among the population as animals cluster around feeding stations where pathogens can be spread. It's hard for us to evaluate this, but a comparison with a natural mineral lick, especially a concentrated one, you would still get the same kind of concentration. We have seen increased use by the mule deer that are in the area, but we have never observed any direct interaction between the mountain goats and the mule deer. Interestingly enough, in this image in the middle bottom, last summer I had two different buck mule deers, which had, to me, what looked like deformed antlers growing. And I found that a little bit strange, considering we were giving them a fairly good source of minerals, but that still wasn't being manifested in the proper antler growth. So we acknowledge that this mineral diversions that we placed above the Lardo in the Lardo Bluffs, it is a bit of a band-aid solution, but it's to a human-caused problem, which is the road salt and the brine used on the highway for human safety, with the rumble strips on the sides and in the middle of the highway. So unless we eliminate the road salt, which isn't going to happen from a highway's perspective, or fence that section, which is not good for animal connectivity and it's unlikely to happen, then this kind of a diversionary salting project may need to be continued for some time to reduce the risk of mountain goat vehicle strikes. So now I'm going to move on to Gimli Ridge. It's in the southern Valhalla Provincial Park in the West Kootenays, west of Nelson. The main site is a campsite on a ridge at about 8,000 feet or 2,450 meters. It's a very popular hiking and climbing area. It's readily accessible up a relatively easy but fairly steep 1.5 to 2 hour hike. And it's become extremely popular with people visiting, especially during COVID. Since the late 1990s, mountain goat numbers at the campsite have increased. So in the mid-1990s, there was generally about 2 animals reported there. By 2010, we heard about smaller nanny groups, and then about 5 to 10 goats in the mid-2010s. When I started my work at Gimli in 2020 and 2021, we were counting 15 to 17 mountain goats within the campsite. The extent of this local population is not exactly clear. It's perhaps 25 to 30 individuals. Again, it's not a wintering area, but it is within a hunting zone. So these goats have become increasingly tolerant of people and do not exhibit the characteristic flight to safety responses. They are displaying fairly pure salt conditioned behavior. And the main attraction appears to be salt deposited by people in the form of urine, primarily near the campsite. And just as an aside, this is some of the best hard rock mountain climbing in southeastern BC, so it does attract a lot of climbers up to this Gimli Peak here. While the goats are not typically aggressive, they can be described as pushing and bold, often approaching to within 1 to 1.5 meters from people. Goats are also pursued climbers at the base of cliffs, at the base of the climbs, with the climbers mentioning their concern for their safety from potentially aggressive goats and rockfall from goats climbing actually above the pitches. A survey conducted by BC Parks in 2023 indicated that some people are not comfortable with this close approach. Quote, they felt like they were being stalked at night by goats and felt uneasy about getting out of the tent. Some of the collared goats that we had also seemed to actually go down the trail to what looks to me like heading off hikers to see if they were urinating on the way up to the campsite. BC Parks' mandate in part is that these parks are managed primarily for the conservation of ecological systems and special features while offering high-quality recreational opportunities that do not impair the park's ecological values and wilderness character. BC Parks has installed and updated information signage. They've installed a urinary diversion outhouse here, and they've increased information on the website. However, research at both Cathedral Provincial Park and at Gimli suggests that despite being well-informed, understanding the issue and the problems, about 30 to 35% of people do not comply with strict use of outhouse facilities, especially at night. in effect, perpetuating the problem. So in 2020, I reviewed the history and options that would be appropriate in a provincial park. And in late 2021, we collared 6 goats, 4 nannies, and 2 billies to begin understanding the patterns of movement and distribution independent of observations and camera data. And then to complement the site management of the urinals and the increased public education, in July of 2022, we established 2 adjacent diversionary licks about 650 meters northwest of the campsite, replenishing the salt in June of 2023 for that season. The criteria we used to establish these lick sites were that they had to be within reasonable access of the campsite for BC Parks for site monitoring and management. They should be in an area that's not typically frequented by hikers and climbers. They should be located adjacent to escape terrain to minimize predation risk. We put in 2 adjacent sites. They're actually only about 25 or 30 meters apart to provide more opportunity for the animals and to make sure that 1 or 2 dominant animals aren't sort of hogging all the access. We're actually planning to put in a 3rd site northeast of the campsite this spring, if it all works out. And again, we added cameras to the sites, and I've looked at nearly 200,000 images from here as well. So the images from 2022 and 2023 were fun to go through. There was lots of images of behaviors, rubbing. The animals weren't bedding at the sites in 2022, but they started that in 2023. And it was interesting to see the dominance between the billies and the nannies, etc. We also, when we collared these animals, we put numbered cattle tags on their webbing of their collar. So from the cameras, we were able to identify individuals from these numbered cattle tags. So I'm going to run you through just a series of 3 maps to show how the behavior and distribution has changed. These maps are showing only the collared nannies, so the 4 nannies. And just to explain the symbols, the campsite is here. Gimli Peak is directly to the north. This is a 150-meter radius circle around the campsite. And this is the location of the diversionary licks, again, with a 150-meter radius circle around them. Now, this is 2021, so remember that these licks are not in place yet. But you can see that the goats, and these different colors here are the 4 different colored animals, they spent an exorbitant amount of time at the campsite and very little time at the future lick site. They also use the bluffs to the south and southwest of the campsite extensively. So on the left side, in 2022, we placed the lick site in, we put the lick site in about halfway through the season. So again, in 2022, you had extensive use by these nannies of the campsite, but they started to use the lick site as well. And more limited use of the habitat to the south. And then flipping to the right side, in 2023, not a single collared nanny came within 140 meters of the campsite the entire year. And there's much heavier use of the lick sites, of course, and almost essentially no use to the south and southwest on these bluffs that were previously used when the animals were using the campsite. And this information parallels what we hear from people and what BC Park staff were seeing. So again, in 2020 and 2021, before this all started, we were seeing 15 to 17 goats within the campsite. And in 2023, what we saw and what we heard from people was often not seeing any goats. And when they did see them, they saw 1 or possibly a maximum of 2. And this is just running through the billies. They were a bit slow on the uptake, as males generally are. In 2022, when we put the lick site in, neither of the 2 collared billies went there. But in 2023, up to about the 24th of June, both billies were using the campsite. That's the orange and the purple dots here. But then on the 24th of June, one of the animals discovered, for lack of a better term, the lick site and actually never went back to the campsite. But the one that hasn't yet discovered it still was using the campsite. So we're quite curious to see what will happen in 2024. And as I mentioned, this was supported in comments from the 2023 surveys. People said, oh, in the past I used to see goats all the time, but not so much now. So the initial results appear to be very promising, although possibly disappointing for some visitors, because Gimli is an area where people know through social media comments to come, and they have a good chance of seeing mountain goats, often up close. And again, this could be considered a band-aid solution, but the alternative is increased risk to both humans and mountain goats. Just to touch briefly on Cathedral Provincial Park in the South Okanagan, in 2018, Kirk Safford with BC Parks, followed by Laura Balex, who was a master's student at a UBCO out of Kelowna, and I think she presented to you last year on her project with some collaring and monitoring. And there was also work done by Vero and colleagues from Thompson Rivers University who did a series of surveys to get visitors information from people visiting Cathedral. Laura worked on a couple of things for her master's, but from the salt perspective, she recommended that Cathedral managers conduct anthropogenic salt control in human use areas. And that was essentially increase the information and the signage and the number of opportunities for using outhouses, put in more outhouses. But she also recommended using diversionary salt along the migratory pathways to try and make it so the animals are less frequenting in the campsite. Kirk provided me with a bit of an update a few weeks ago on where they are with Cathedral. There are still close human-goat interactions, and salt conditioning is likely the main reason. And Cathedral is trying to manage options other than using a diversionary lick for now. Their approach is to improve the messaging and the infrastructure with more outhouses. The wildfire from 2023, which burned up a lot of BC and Canada and elsewhere, did throw a bit of a curveball into the picture, since that area was also affected. They still get similar numbers of goats in the campsite, but they've not been receiving reports of aggressive goats. And anecdotally, the behavior and the interaction seems to have toned down a bit. Interestingly enough, he told me that across the lake is a private lodge that's been there forever. And last winter, the lodge actually salted their deck and walkway. So they actually had goats up on their deck, which not in the winter, but after the winter. So that was probably not the best move. So the use of diversionary mineral licks could be considered an interim solution, but again, to emphasize, we're trying to mitigate human-caused issues. We're essentially giving the goats a higher quality source of what they seek. We're hoping to alter their behaviors so that it may not be continued to pass down through the generations. And then you've seen in these images, especially at Gimli, the kids are just learning from the nannies of going up to people and trying to get access to salt. So we offer that diversionary salt licks should be considered as a viable management option to reduce human-goat interactions where appropriate. And just to I'd like to thank my co-authors on these projects. The folks up in the Lardo Valley have been great to work with. Their passion and interest in their local wildlife is something to behold. And it's been a real treat working with BC Park staff. And I thank them for all their support. And Ministry of Waterland and Resource Stewardship, sorry, they've changed their name so many times. They also helped us with that. The Lardo work was supported by Leonard Zaleski formerly with the Ministry of Highways, and Matt Jones. And we've been funded on these projects through Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure and BC Parks through their license plate program funding, as well as we've had support from Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. That was some great information. So now for everyone listening, if you have any questions, you can throw them still in the comments and I can ask for you. You can unmute yourself and ask away. I actually, though, have a question for you, Kim. When I was advertising actually for your webinar here, and I'm sure you've gotten this question many times working in kind of like, wildlife human management. Do you have any comments on like the idea of maybe just excluding humans from certain habitats?
Yeah, that was from the Lardo perspective, that's not possible. It's a highway. From the Gimli perspective, yes, one of the options is fencing the campsite or closing the camp area. But that's not very practical. The Gimli area is a real draw for people. They love going there. If we shut it down, not me, if BC Parks closed it off, fenced it off, which would have been prohibitively expensive, it probably wouldn't have been the best way to do it in our situation. I know they've addressed those kind of situations in the States a fair bit, or in some areas, but it wasn't practical. So we were trying to come up with something else that would work before we go to those fairly more drastic stages.
No, that makes sense. All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I don't want to. Oh, we got one. Is there any benefits to overall herd health and herd recruitment in remote herds of goats using artificial salt deposits?
Good question. The Lardo population is probably a little bit lower than it used to be, but it has stabilized, and numbers, as best they can tell, it's a very difficult area to survey, seem to be slowly coming up. The kid crop and the yearling crop, which I get to look at in the images, has been quite good the last few years. In the Gimli area, again, we don't have a good handle on population trend, and especially now that we've disrupted the system so that the goats aren't coming into the campsite. We are getting counts off the cameras, but yeah, it's hard to say. 2 years ago, I believe, we actually had a total bust on the kid crop. So something happened with either productivity or survival. So no kids were associated with any of the nannies. But this past year, I think out of the 8 or 9 nannies, I think every one but 1 or 2 had kids. Okay. So it goes in normal cycles that are driven by a whole bunch of things. Everything, most of it probably related to weather, severity, and weather factors affecting forage.
That makes sense. Unfortunately, everything's a more complicated answer, hey?
That one is, for sure.
How long are these artificial salt sites expected to remain usable? Do they have to be replenished?
Yeah, that's another good question. At the beginning, especially with the Lardo, since we started there before Gimli got going, I realized I was giving these goats hypertension. It was just way too much salt. We'd go back several months later and you dig down, you still see big chunks of it. So we've actually cut back a fair bit on how much is there. The thing that's just astounded me in both these projects is how fast the goats come into these sites, especially in the Gimli, which wasn't the area they were totally frequenting. I can't remember the numbers now. Sorry, it's just blended too much. But within hours or within half a day, goats were on the mineral lick sites. It was quite quick. But if you set up the site well and dig the salt, the loose livestock salt, I would never use blocks. If you dig it into the ground it lasts. We go there in the spring up at Gimli, and there's still residual salt, same as Lardo. So we've been cutting back. We can still put in you need to maintain it once for sure, maybe twice a year, and then it should be good to go.
Okay. Good to know. Alrighty. I think I'm not seeing any more hands. I'm not seeing
Actually,
any more. Yes.
I've got a question for Helen, if I may.
For sure.
If Helen is interested in taking it. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Jim.
You and I have chatted about this before, I know, about the considerations of pathogens and disease. Gimli, there was never I never had an image of any other type of ungulate at the Gimli sites. It is concentrating goats for sure, but they were being concentrated around the campsite anyway. Lardo is a little bit of a different situation where we seem to have more mule deer at the sites, but not much of anything else. Bears and predators go through. How much of a concern, or what should we be looking for in this situation? And just for those that may not know, Helen is a recently retired provincial veterinarian with decades of experience with this kind of stuff.
I don't know, Kim, I don't know if you saw the chat, but I actually added something in there about antlered malformation.
Oh, good.
It could be a sequela to blue tongue or EHD virus infection. And we do see that coming into BC every few years or so. So that's a possibility. But really, if you look at all the diseases that deer and goats can get, there really isn't that much that they share. With salt and mineral licks, probably the biggest issue that I've seen is transmission of contagious ecthyma or sore mouth. And simply because it's a virus that causes lesions around the mouth, and the salt is abrasive. Scabs that contain the virus can live on the earth or in the environment for decades. Well, maybe decades, but at least it's documented for 10 years or so. So that's probably the biggest thing. And the way I would deal with that is that if you saw an outbreak of sore mouth, you kind of want to shut down at least the lick, and it is fatal to mountain goats. So that's probably the biggest concern. And it's one of the best reasons to be careful, like you have been, digging the salt down into the soil so that they're not grabbing a whole bunch and abrading their mouths. But back to the mule deer. The mule deer right now, I think everybody knows that one of the biggest concerns is chronic wasting disease, and there's no documented evidence that mountain goats are susceptible to chronic wasting disease. All the viruses and odds and ends that are going to affect mule deer and goats at the same time are going to affect them at the same time, whether they're sharing a lick or not. So it's not a huge concern, but it is something to pay attention to.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's the same conclusion you and I came to a number of years ago when I chatted with you about this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that's good to know. Thank you.
You took all my advice and made it shine. You've just done such a great job at documenting this.
Okay, thanks.
We did get a couple more questions for you, Kim, and thank you for that, Helen. That was maybe I should have you on a webinar in the future. We had a question from Marvin, actually. He was curious if you know why the billies were slower to react to the diversionary salt lick.
Yeah, great question. No, I don't. They were, the nannies and the billies used kind of a route along the edge, the western edge, the base of Gimli Peak to get out to what we call Mulvey Ridge to get over, so they're all kind of they're in the same area, but they're not at the lick. And why the billies have been so slow, I really don't know. Even among uncollared billies, it seemed to be that they were slower to get there. Maybe the demand for the salt in the nannies with lactation and pregnancy and lactation and the whole bit. Maybe
Yeah, I
it's
think
higher,
that's it,
the
Kim.
drive is more. What's that?
When you're around licks, you'll often see ewes or nannies aim for it around about the time that those kids or lambs are about 4 to 8 weeks of age. Same thing happens in domestic animals. They just sort of pound the minerals at that time of year. And I do think it's because of the lactation.
Right. So they just have a bigger drive to get the higher quality of what we're giving them.
Yeah, I think so.
That makes sense.
Fair enough. Thanks, Helen. I see Rich has his hand up.
Yes, I was just going to say, go ahead. Go ahead, Rich.
Thanks, Kim. Hey, great presentation. So if I understand, Gimli is in a provincial park, right? I'm curious.
Southern edge of a park, yes.
I'm curious to know how the park authorities responded to your institution of an artificial lick. It sounds like you must have gotten some cooperation or bullied them into
it. It wouldn't have happened without it. I was basically contracted to BC Parks to do this whole project and worked closely with a number of them, and a number of them are actually on the call here. So yeah, they approved what we're doing. They looked at all the options that I presented to them, and we discussed it and decided this was the best shot, especially, when we started this thing, the goats were overrunning the campsite basically, and they would come to within a meter and a half. They could catch them with a butterfly net. So something had to change. It was just the trajectory was going in the wrong way. So yeah, this has the full support of BC Parks.
Well, my hat's off to them as well as to you. Just the reason I ask is in the States, these are typically situations I'm most familiar with are usually on U.S. Forest Service land, and oftentimes in designated wilderness. And it's just been very difficult for some of the local bios to convince managers that it's worth trying this. They're just so leery of doing anything that strikes them as being unnatural. So good example.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I, you don't go into this lightly because you're changing the system, but as I said a couple of times, we're fixing an issue that's human caused anyway, either getting struck on the highway, which doesn't work well, or overrunning people and making them scared and getting the odd, aggressive goat. That doesn't work well either. So it's an interim solution. 10 years down the road, will BC Parks be doing this at Gimli? I don't know, but maybe we can break the habit. The problem, though, Rich, as I mentioned, is that I don't know, despite having collared animals, and I've been looking at goats and surveying and following collars for decades, I can't find a natural mineral lick there. I think it's just so depleted on the landscape from geology and weathering and geography and all that human urine is just too much of an attraction. So we're giving them something better than that, and it may be a long-term Band-Aid solution unless something else comes up. But good point.
That's actually a good segue to the next question that was in our comments. How well does the applied salt and like the diversionary salt, how well does that mimic a natural lick?
Aha, that's an excellent question. I've co-supervised an undergrad thesis at the University of Victoria by Georgia Duville, and she looked at the salt component or the mineral components of a confirmed goat lick, road salt or road highways, and diversionary salts up in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks in BC. And there are differences. Of course, the livestock salt is very heavily based on sodium chloride, but what her work found that it wasn't always sodium that was one of the main drivers. Often it was calcium or magnesium. So there are ways of balancing it up, but I do know examples with sheep, bighorn sheep in the East Kootenays, where they've tried to mimic some fancy cookbook type of salt to attract the animals better, and it doesn't seem to be working. I haven't done any feeding trials. If I was to do anything, I'd probably put more calcium into the system. But I use salt that has mostly salt, of course, these livestock salt, but I also have a lot of the trace minerals in there as well. It's kind of a shotgun approach. And I don't know what else I could do, but we could, and I think they are looking at that in the national parks to try and come up with a better salt that mimics the natural salt licks, but it's challenging because there's so much divergence among them.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well,
good,
and like you
good
said,
point.
as you raised the point earlier, like, you know, you're working on a human caused problem anyway, so. Alrighty. I think I will do a last call for questions. I'm not seeing any new ones in the comments, and I'm not seeing any hands up. So I think with that, I always like to, oh, see, there's another one. Would salting habitat that has been, would salting habitat that has declining herd numbers possibly help turn around populations that are being targeted harder by predators or people in remote areas?
That's a complex, there's a complex answer to that. And I don't know if I want to go into it. There's a lot of things that, of course, driving mountain goat populations. I've been working with the BC government on mountain goat surveys and basically population management for, again, over 2 decades. And we've been tracking cycles in the goats, especially in the Kootenays, the East Kootenays, where they were high, they went down, they're coming back perhaps. There's a multitude of things driving that as you could guess, everything from cycles in climate to avalanche cycles to winter severity to precipitation in the summer and fall, which affects survival, to predator numbers. And we did see, you know, predators 20, 30, 40 years ago slowly moved back into parts of the Kootenays in higher numbers than they used to be. It's complex how much of a key function that minerals and access to mineral licks would play. I think it's critical to the populations. I've got many examples of these animals doing long movements, which are risky for their survival to get to salt licks or mineral licks, natural ones. Mm-hmm. So they need to do it as part of their system. How critical that is for the population to increase, and it's hard to know. I don't know how you would balance all those different factors. It's not a simple system, but good
like
question. Nice, good to think about.
Complicated question with a complicated answer. All right. I think this will be my last call for questions before I stop the recording and say thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anything pop up, not seeing any hands. So thank you so much, Kim. That was a very informative presentation. There was lots of questions, so that makes me very happy to always have. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us. I will end the recording here. And